For centuries before European settlers arrived, tribal nations effectively governed their unique societies. Upon its founding, the United States, driven by a relentless need for land and resources, negotiated hundreds of treaties directly with tribal governments. Through these treaties, tribal governments surrendered vast expanses of land and agreed to waive certain sovereign powers in exchange for protection and services. However, the fundamental authority of tribal nations to self-govern persisted. Nearly 200 years later, tribal governments continue to reclaim sovereign powers by taking back administration over the programs that serve their citizens and decisions that affect their communities. We'll delve into pivotal moments in the history of tribal self-governance, spanning from European contact to the present day. While efforts to weaken tribal sovereignty persisted during the treaty-making era and beyond, the inherent right of tribal nations to self-govern was never extinguished. Despite legal precedents, sovereignty continued to be violated, resulting in a tumultuous period marked by the forced relocation of Indigenous peoples, known as the Indian Removal. In 1871, Congress stopped ratifying treaties with tribal nations and claimed sole authority to make laws for tribal governments and their citizens. Afterward, they, along with the courts, took actions that eroded tribal authority.
We see an era in which, once again, the government of the United States' solution to what it viewed as an Indian problem was to effectively eliminate the tribe. So through most of the 20th century, we see a period of time in which the Cherokee Nation government couldn't function much in the way you'd think a government could function.
Federal Indian policy took another dark turn when the United States initiated assimilation and land allotment policies. These policies, that included ripping children out of their homes to send them to boarding schools and other horrid practices, sought to dismantle tribal institutions, cultural connections, and the overall way of life in tribal communities. In 1934, a departure from assimilation and allotment era policies occurred with the Indian Reorganization Act, the Oklahoma Welfare Act, and the Alaska Indian Reorganization Act. Although flawed, these acts ended allotment of tribal land, acknowledged tribal governments, and promoted the adoption of constitutions by tribal nations. 20 years after the Indian Reorganization Act, Congress swiftly changed direction and sought out termination-era policies, once again aimed at dismantling tribal governments by stripping them of their status as nations.
And then when we came here to Oklahoma, between 1830 and 1983, the President of the United States appointed our chief. So we didn't have a whole lot of ability to self-govern.
Federal initiatives like relocation further devastated tribal communities, uprooting individuals and families from reservations to urban centers.
Families are usually housed in apartment buildings in residential neighborhoods, close to grocery stores and shops.
Thankfully, termination-era policies of the 1950s were short-lived, as advocacy for tribal self-determination gained momentum in the 1960s. In 1965, President Johnson delivered his Forgotten American message, proposing a new direction for Indian programs, a shift away from termination towards self-determination. This new approach aimed to replace paternalistic attitudes with a focus on partnership and self-help. In the 1970s, policies of Indian self-determination began to take root. President Nixon directly opposed termination-era policies.
Because termination is morally and legally unacceptable, because it produces bad practical results, and because the mere threat of termination tends to discourage self-sufficiency among Indian groups, I'm asking the Congress to pass a new concurrent resolution which would expressly renounce, repudiate, and repeal the termination policy.
The administration gave a basic change of direction today to federal programs for American Indians, putting more control into the hands of the Indians themselves. The change affects schools, jobs, and natural resources.
In 1975, landmark legislation was signed into law, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, formally ushering in a new era of federal Indian policy. This act allows tribal nations to manage certain programs previously overseen by the Indian Health Service and the Department of the Interior through self-determination contracts.
That law allowed tribes to receive funding that ordinarily went to the federal government to provide services for tribes.
While the passage of the ISDA is a significant step for tribal sovereignty, tribal nations face challenges in implementing their new authority. reports and hearings are conducted to identify obstacles to self-determination contracting.
You look back at the 1970s when the federal government was thankfully unshackling Indian nations in terms of our ability to govern ourselves. And so you look at that point in history and you see development.
Over the next decade, the federal-tribal relationships become more and more strained as federal bureaucrats hinder the use of authority granted by the ISDA, and instances of federal corruption and mismanagement of programs intended for tribal communities come to light. These revelations, coupled with pressure from tribal leaders, laid the groundwork for the expansion of tribal authority.
Between 1974 and the late 80s, there ended up being a lot of mismanagement and abuse and misuse by the system in terms of how it was managing these resources.
Americans have come to expect the best medical care that money can buy, but not all Americans. For one segment of this society, health care is not just woefully inadequate. It's become a nightmare. We are talking about Native Americans, American Indians.
In 1988, tribal leaders testified before Congress and proposed a tribally developed amendment to ISDA that provided tribal nations with an opportunity to assume greater control over the administration of federal resources intended for their communities, which they term self-governance.
In 1988, there were a number of prominent tribal leaders, national tribal leaders, who were testifying before Congress.
So we came up with a proposal that was an amendment to the Self-Determination Act that we coined self-governance.
Self-governance was a bill that said, provide us with the funding, but also allow us the ability to design our own programs and then manage them.
I think the only way you can fulfill the commitment that we've made as a nation to treat the tribes as sovereign nations and on a government-to-government basis is to provide them with self-governance.
Self-governance was based on the idea that tribal governments should receive both funding and the authority to design and manage federal programs that serve their communities without federal interference. Congress approved the amendments, establishing a 5-year demonstration project within the Department of the Interior. 10 tribes across the country participated. This project expanded tribal authority, reduced federal oversight, and provided greater flexibility for tribal governments to redesign and reallocate resources to meet the unique needs of their communities.
Things were so bad in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the best thing you could do is just turn it over to the tribes, let the tribes be on their own. Turn them free.
In the early 90s, Congress further solidified tribal self-governance authority by passing several acts that extended the demonstration project to more tribal nations and an additional federal agency, the Indian Health Service. Soon after, in 1993, Congress acknowledged the success of self-governance authority and in 1994 made self-governance a permanent option for tribal nations to use for assuming administration of programs, services, functions, and activities from the Department of the Interior. Tribal nations across the country started planning for and negotiating self-governance agreements with the department. At the turn of the century, in 2000, Congress made self-governance a permanent option for the tribal nations to assume administration of programs, services, functions, and activities from the Indian Health Service. Congress also instructed the Department of Health and Human Services to explore the feasibility of extending self-governance to other programs beyond IHS. DHS completed a study in the early 2000s, finding that expansion of self-governance to additional HHS programs was feasible, but the department believed it would need additional legislation from the Congress to move forward. In the following decade, the implementation of self-governance authority was refined and clarified through significant legal decisions and legislation that introduced key tenets of self-determination and self-governance into housing, education, natural resources, law enforcement, agriculture, and transportation. For example, the Hearth Act of 2012 enabled federally recognized tribal nations to lease restricted Indian lands for residential, business, agriculture, wind, and solar use without the approval of the Secretary of the Interior. In addition, in 2015, self-governance authority was extended to the Department of Transportation, and the 2018 Farm Bill established the Food Distribution Program for Indian Reservations Self-Determination Demonstration Project, the first step introducing self-determination authority to food and nutrition programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The Progress for Indian Tribes Act passed in 2020, building on the foundation of successful tribal self-governance policy by making key improvements to enhance efficient tribal administration of federal programs and services. Tribal self-governance has been the most successful Indian policy in the history of federal tribal relations. More than 380 tribal nations across the country use self-governance authority for the delivery of one or more federal programs to their communities. For many tribal nations, self-governance is more than an authority used to administer federal programs. The concept is ingrained in every action and decision of the tribal government, using resources and implementing programs in ways that are most effective to meet local needs and that align with local priorities. While the history of self-governance is an overwhelming success, there is much more to do. Self-governance remains limited in its applicability to only a few agencies, and some federal agencies that serve tribal nations and their citizens remain reluctant to relinquish control to tribal governments. Tribal self-governance is about the fundamental right of a people to determine their own destiny and to prosper and flourish on their own terms, so that tribal nations are allowed to administer federal programs and resources to their communities.